The country was caught completely off guard by a moment of raw, unfiltered grief that would ripple through every corner of the nation and shake the very foundations of how Americans understand tragedy and unity. Vice President JD Vance, a man known for his steady composure and measured words throughout his political career, stood before the American people offering a prayer for his close friend Charlie Kirk, a prayer that came only hours after Charlie was murdered at a campus event in Utah. The weight of those words, the trembling in his voice, the tears that he could not hold back no matter how hard he tried, it was all there for the world to witness in what would become one of the most emotionally devastating moments in recent American political history. Millions watched as Vance struggled through sentences that seemed to hold the whole nation together, each word carrying the burden of a country's sorrow and the personal anguish of losing a brother in every way that mattered. He was remembering a man who had devoted his entire life to conservative causes and the ideals of liberty, a man who believed with every fiber of his being that young people deserved to hear the truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable, even when it made him unpopular, even when it put a target on his back. A man who had become more than a political figure, he had become a symbol of conviction in an age of compromise, a beacon of authenticity in a world drowning in manufactured personas. The tribute landed like a punch to the chest that left no one untouched. One of those scenes that will be replayed for years to come, dissected by historians and remembered by ordinary Americans alike. One of those moments that generations will point to and say, that was when America mourned together, regardless of political affiliation or personal beliefs. It was a moment that would leave a nation crying side by side, united not by politics or ideology, but by the shared experience of losing someone who had touched so many lives in ways they never fully realized until the terrible finality of his absence became real. Utah Valley University had been electric that night, with an energy that those present would never forget. The anticipation in the air was palpable, almost crackling with excitement and curiosity. Students had lined up hours early, their enthusiasm barely contained, as they waited for the chance to engage with one of the most talked-about figures in conservative politics. Charlie Kirk, the conservative organizer who had rallied countless young people to engage in the political process and think critically about the world around them, stood on stage taking hard questions with his usual composure and characteristic patience. He had done this hundreds of times before, standing firm in the face of hostility, listening carefully to opposing viewpoints, responding thoughtfully, even to those who came seeking confrontation rather than conversation. It was what he did best, and it was what made him different from so many others in the political arena. Where others might have dismissed or mocked, Charlie engaged. Where others might have retreated, Charlie advanced with kindness and conviction. The auditorium was packed to capacity that night, every seat filled with eager faces, some supportive, some skeptical, all curious. Young faces looking up at a man who had given them permission to think for themselves, to question the narratives they'd been fed, to stand up for what they believed, even when the pressure to conform felt overwhelming. Charlie moved across the stage with the confidence of someone who believed deeply in what he was saying, yet with the humility of someone who genuinely wanted to understand those who disagreed. His words flowed naturally that evening, punctuated by moments of humor that drew genuine laughter from the crowd and created an atmosphere of warmth despite the sometimes contentious nature of the topics being discussed. He was in his element, doing exactly what he was born to do, building bridges through dialogue, changing minds through respect, and proving that civil discourse was still possible in an increasingly divided nation. Then, in an instant that would replay in the minds of everyone present for the rest of their lives, the atmosphere ruptured with violent finality. A sharp sound cut through the air, a sound that didn't belong, a sound that seemed to freeze time itself. For a fraction of a second, confusion swept through the room like a wave. Some thought it was a technical malfunction, maybe a speaker popping or equipment falling. Others wondered if something had dropped from the ceiling or if there was some kind of electrical problem. Then the screams began, and reality crashed through the confusion with devastating clarity. Security surged forward with trained precision, their bodies moving on instinct born of countless hours of preparation for moments exactly like this. In mere seconds, the calm of the auditorium erupted into absolute chaos that no one could have anticipated. Charlie fell, clutching his chest, his expression shifting from surprise to something else. Something that spoke of a man facing the unthinkable, something that those closest to the stage would never be able to erase from their memories. Students scattered in every direction, stumbling toward exits with no clear idea of where safety might be found. Some froze in disbelief, their minds refusing to process what their eyes had just witnessed. Others cried out names of friends they couldn't find in the pandemonium, their voices joining the cacophony of terror that filled the space. Parents watching remotely through live streams felt their hearts stop. as the feed dissolved into chaos. Footsteps thundered against the floor with a force that seemed to shake the very building. The sound was deafening, the combined weight of hundreds of people desperate to escape something they couldn't fully comprehend, something that had no place in a venue dedicated to the exchange of ideas. The shooter vanished into the darkness of that terrible night, leaving behind a scene of devastation and 1,000 unanswered questions that would haunt families, investigators, and a nation searching for any explanation that could make sense of something so fundamentally senseless. Within minutes, phones across the country lit up with alerts that would stop hearts mid-beat and bring entire households to stunned silence. Charlie Kirk shot at Utah Valley University. Those 6 words traveled at the speed of the digital age, reaching living rooms and bedrooms and offices in every state within moments of being released. Across America, people sat frozen, trying desperately to understand what had happened, trying to reconcile the image of the vibrant, passionate man they had seen on television and social media with the incomprehensible reality of those 6 devastating words. Social media filled with shock and grief that spread like wildfire. Posts flooded every platform, some sharing memories, others simply expressing disbelief that bordered on denial. "This can't be real," one comment read, echoing the sentiment of millions. "Please, God, let this be a mistake. Let this be fake news." But it wasn't a mistake, it wasn't fake news. It was the new reality that a grieving nation would have to face, process, and somehow find a way to move through. If you've ever lost someone suddenly, without warning, without the chance to say goodbye, without any opportunity to prepare your heart for the absence that would follow, you know exactly what millions of Americans felt in that moment. That shock that makes everything around you seem unreal. That desperate hope that maybe you misunderstood, maybe there's been an error, maybe you'll wake up and discover it was all a terrible dream. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel and how many hearts they touch along the way. In Washington, a message reached Vice President Vance in the West Wing during what had been an ordinary evening of work. He was in the middle of reviewing briefing documents, his mind occupied with the endless responsibilities of his office and the countless decisions that demanded his attention. Then his aide appeared in the doorway, face pale with an expression that immediately signaled something catastrophic. The aide's phone was extended with trembling hands, and JD felt his stomach drop before he even knew why. He took the device, read the message, and the world around him seemed to collapse into that small, glowing screen. Everything else, the briefing documents, the meetings, the responsibilities, faded into meaningless background noise. His hands shook as he read the words again and again, hoping somehow they would change, hoping his mind was playing tricks on him, hoping for any explanation other than the obvious one. His throat tightened with emotion that threatened to overwhelm him completely. The words blurred before his eyes as he read them for the 3rd time, the 4th time, the 5th time, each reading somehow making the reality more concrete and more unbearable. The man he called friend, more like a brother in every way that mattered, had been taken in an act that many would call unimaginable. In a single moment, everything JD had planned for that evening, that week, that month, shifted into irrelevance. In that instant, JD's private world and the country's public grief collided with devastating force that left no room for the usual barriers between personal and political. His loss became the nation's loss, his tears would become the nation's tears, and everyone who understood the depth of their friendship, who had witnessed their bond at events and in interviews and through countless shared moments, braced themselves for the prayer they knew he would give. A prayer that would need to carry the weight of millions of broken hearts while somehow finding words adequate to the impossible task. Outside the campus in Utah, sirens screamed their urgent warnings as federal and local officers swarmed the area with a force that spoke to the magnitude of what had occurred. Red and blue lights painted everything in harsh rotating colors that seemed garish against the darkness of the tragedy they illuminated. Helicopters sliced through the night sky with their powerful spotlights combing rooftops and parking lots and every shadow that might conceal answers or the perpetrator who had shattered so many lives. The sound was overwhelming to those present. Sirens, rotors, shouted commands, and beneath it all the muffled crying of students who had witnessed something no young person should ever see. First responders moved with urgent purpose while trying to maintain the calm authority that crisis demanded. Investigators began their work even as the echoes of chaos still hung in the air. Students huddled in parking lots throughout the campus, some holding each other in silent grief that needed no words, others on phones with loved ones who had seen the news and called in panic, all trying desperately to make sense of what they had witnessed. A young woman sat on a curb with her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul. A group of young men stood in a tight circle with their arms around each other, their expressions blank with the kind of shock that hasn't yet transformed into grief. A voice that had once calmed, provoked, and inspired millions was suddenly gone, and the silence it left behind was deafening in its finality. The questions that filled that silence, why, how, what comes next, would remain unanswered for many in the hours and days that followed. President Donald Trump addressed the nation from the Oval Office within hours of the tragedy, his face ashen with grief and controlled fury evident in every carefully chosen word. He sat behind the resolute desk with American flags flanking him, the weight of the moment visible in the lines of his face and the set of his jaw. This was not a planned address, not a speech prepared by teams of writers and vetted by communications staff. This was a president responding in real time to a tragedy that had struck at the heart of American political discourse. "This vile attack on Charlie Kirk," he said, his voice steady but tinged with barely contained emotion that occasionally broke through his usual confidence, "was an attack on America itself, an attack on free speech, an attack on the right of every American to engage in the marketplace of ideas without fear of violence." The president leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting the camera with an intensity that conveyed the depth of his determination and his personal connection to the loss. "The guilty will be found," he declared with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "There will be justice, and it will be unforgiving. We will pursue every lead, examine every piece of evidence, and bring those responsible to account for this heinous act." His words carried the force of a promise, not just to the American people watching at home, but to the family of a man who had served the conservative movement with unwavering dedication, and to the millions of young people who had found their voice through Charlie's encouragement. Yet beyond the Oval Office's emphatic words and promises of justice, the public wanted something else, something more personal, something more human. They wanted the one person who had stood closest to Charlie, JD Vance. They wanted his prayer, his recollection, the human confession of loss that could only come from someone who had walked alongside Charlie through the highs and lows of their shared journey. They wanted to grieve with someone who truly understood what had been lost, not in political terms, but in personal ones. JD sat alone in his office in the West Wing, head bowed, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of a city that continued moving even as his world had stopped completely. The press corps had gathered outside the White House, cameras ready, reporters preparing their questions and arranging their notes. But those preparations felt irrelevant to him in that private moment of grief. The trappings of political life, the press conferences, the talking points, the carefully crafted statements, none of it mattered now. He thought of the last time Charlie hugged him. It had been just 3 weeks earlier, at a fundraising event, where they had laughed about old times and made plans for the future that now would never come to be. They had talked about their families, about upcoming events, about the direction of the movement they both cared so deeply about. Plans that would never come to fruition, dreams that would remain forever unfulfilled. The last time Charlie whispered those words that had carried JD through so many difficult moments, "I'm praying for you, brother." Those 5 simple words had become a lifeline during JD's darkest hours in politics, a reminder that someone believed in him unconditionally. Now it was JD who needed to pray for his friend. Now it was JD who had to find the words that could somehow honor a life cut tragically short. For a while, he simply stared at a photograph of the two of them. It sat on his desk in a simple silver frame, 2 friends laughing backstage at a Turning Point event, their faces bright with the joy of shared purpose and mutual respect. The moment captured in that photograph felt like it belonged to a different lifetime now. A lifetime where tragedy was something that happened to other people, where tomorrow was always guaranteed. JD let the weight of memory press in, each recollection sharper than the last. Charlie's infectious laugh that could fill a room, his unwavering loyalty that never wavered regardless of the political winds, the way he always knew exactly what to say when JD needed encouragement, when the criticism felt too heavy, when the path forward seemed unclear. All of it was gone now, preserved only in memory and the ache of absence. Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on this story below. If you were in JD Vance's position right now, if you had just lost your closest friend, your brother in every meaningful way, and an entire nation was waiting for you to speak, to give voice to their grief, what would be going through your mind? What words could possibly be adequate to such a moment? I read every single one of your comments, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this impossible situation. The White House briefing room felt different than any other public room JD had entered in his entire career. The hush in the air was not just the reporters' professionalism, though they were trying their best to maintain the composure that their profession demanded. It was sorrow turned silent. It was the collective weight of a nation holding its breath, waiting to exhale only when given permission to grieve openly. When JD walked in, his face was pale with exhaustion and emotion. His eyes were rimmed red with tears that had already been shed, and those still waiting, the usual jostle of microphones and impatient questions, the competitive energy that typically filled press briefings, gave way to a heavy, reverent quiet that seemed almost sacred in its depth. No one called out for attention, no one jockeyed for position. The gravity of the moment demanded something different from everyone present. He steadied his hands on the podium as if it were the only thing holding him upright, his knuckles whitening against the polished wood. He paused long enough for everyone to feel the pause, a silence that stretched across seconds that felt like hours, giving space for the magnitude of what had happened to settle over the room. This was not a scripted address crafted by speechwriters. This was not a politician delivering talking points designed to achieve some strategic objective. It was a man trying to speak for a country that had suddenly lost one of its most passionate voices. When he finally began, his voice trembled with emotion he made no attempt to disguise. He called the killing what it was, an act of pure evil that defied comprehension, a cowardly assault on the values Charlie had championed throughout his too brief life. The words came hard, each one pulled from somewhere deep within him, each one costing something to speak aloud. He spoke of Charlie's faith, his conviction, and the way he lived his life unapologetically in accordance with his beliefs. Charlie never apologized for believing in America, JD said, his voice catching on the words. He never backed down from a fight worth fighting. He never retreated from truth just because truth was unpopular. Charlie was a man of faith, JD continued, his voice breaking with emotion that he made no attempt to hide from the cameras or the millions watching. He embraced Christ with his whole heart, with every action and every word. Tonight I imagine the Lord welcoming him home, saying, "Well done, good and faithful servant." The biblical reference resonated through the room with a power that transcended political boundaries. Tears flowed openly throughout the room, from reporters who had interviewed Charlie, from staff members watching from doorways, from millions of viewers across the nation who felt like they were there with him, sharing in the grief of that moment. The shared humanity of the moment broke through every professional barrier. Television networks shifted to live coverage across the board, interrupting regular programming to broadcast this moment of national mourning. Anchors did their best to calm their own voices while trying to piece together the timeline of events coming out of Utah. Their professionalism wavered in the face of such raw human emotion, and many made no attempt to hide their own tears. Some wiped moisture from their eyes between updates. Others simply fell silent, allowing JD's words to speak for themselves without interruption. Students who had been at the event in Utah gave interviews from the campus, their words choked by sobs that wouldn't stop no matter how hard they tried to compose themselves. He was talking about faith and freedom, one young woman said through tears that streamed down her face and dropped onto her university sweatshirt. He was answering questions, being so patient with everyone who challenged him, so kind even to people who weren't kind to him. Then the shot. I still hear it. I'll always hear it. Every time I close my eyes. Her voice broke completely, and she turned away from the camera, unable to continue. The reporter didn't push for more. There was nothing more to say. Across the country, churches opened their doors for impromptu prayer vigils that drew hundreds in some communities and thousands in others. Families closed rank around dinner tables, holding hands and bowing heads in prayer for a family they'd never met, but somehow felt connected to through shared grief. People who had never met Charlie found themselves grieving as if someone close to them had been lost, because in a way, something had been lost that belonged to all of them. The communal mourning transcended political lines in a way that felt almost unprecedented in recent American memory. Liberal and conservative, young and old, urban and rural, all of America seemed to pause in shared sorrow. The usual arguments and divisions that filled social media feeds went quiet, replaced by prayers and condolences and expressions of shock. Back in the West Wing, JD's phone buzzed without pause. Messages of condolence and outrage poured in from supporters, political figures, foreign leaders, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by Charlie's work. He didn't read them, he couldn't. Instead, he sat trying to find the right words that might lift others, even as he felt crushed beneath the weight of his own grief. He had spoken to the nation, but the work of mourning had only begun. He remembered the first time Charlie had reached out to him, a short note of encouragement after a TV appearance in 2017. JD had been relatively unknown then, his book Hillbilly Elegy newly published and generating discussion, his future in politics still uncertain and unformed. That small gesture, those few words of support from someone JD admired and respected, had planted a seed that would grow into one of the most meaningful relationships of his entire life. That brief kindness had blossomed into a deep friendship and a partnership that had shaped JD's entire path forward. Charlie had believed in him before most people did, when JD himself wasn't entirely sure what he was capable of achieving. He'd counseled him through major decisions that would prove pivotal, including prospects that would change his life forever in ways neither of them could have predicted at the time. Late-night phone calls about strategy and purpose had become a regular feature of their friendship. Shared prayers during moments of doubt when the path forward seemed impossible. Charlie had been there through it all, a steady presence in a world of constant change and relentless criticism. He never wavered, never suggested that the fight wasn't worth fighting, never let JD believe that the obstacles were insurmountable. Now that steady voice was gone, and in the silence it left behind, JD could hear echoes of every conversation they'd shared, every laugh they'd enjoyed, every moment of brotherhood that had sustained them both through the ups and downs of public life. Social media, filled with memories as the night wore on, old photographs from campus events and rallies circulated, shared by thousands who wanted to remember Charlie as he had lived, full of energy and conviction and warmth. Young people posted stories about how Charlie had given them the courage to speak up in classrooms where their views were unwelcome, to stand by their beliefs even when it was deeply unpopular. College students shared how a single conversation with Charlie had changed their entire perspective on what was possible, on what they could achieve, on who they could become. The grief was vast, stretching across the entire nation, but so was a rare unity that had been missing from American life for far too long. For once, the divisions that often define public discourse softened under the weight of shared sorrow. Politicians who disagreed on nearly everything found common ground in mourning. Media figures who had criticized Charlie's positions now acknowledged his passion and dedication. The walls that usually separated Americans from one another seemed to crumble, if only for a moment of shared humanity. Before we go deeper into what happened next, I would love to hear your point of view on this remarkable moment. Tell me what part of this story has hit you the hardest so far. Was it JD's trembling voice as he struggled to speak? The image of those students huddled in parking lots, trying to make sense of the senseless? The silence in that briefing room? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters more than you know, and every comment helps us understand how these stories touch real lives. The phone rang again in JD's office. He answered, knowing who it would be before he heard the voice. It was the president. "I know he was close to you," Trump said, his voice low and measured with an unusual gentleness that spoke to the depth of the moment. The commander-in-chief paused before continuing, allowing the silence to acknowledge what words couldn't fully express. "Charlie loved his family, Erica and those kids. They were everything to him." Trump continued, "We can't let this break us. We must carry on what he fought for. That's what he would want. That's what honor demands." JD listened, gripping the phone as if it tethered him to resolve when everything in him wanted to collapse. The president's words weren't political, they weren't strategic, they were personal, the words of someone who understood loss and the terrible responsibility of moving forward when every instinct said to stop, to grieve, to retreat from the world. The call underscored the decision the White House soon announced. JD would lead a national moment of prayer that evening. It was what the nation needed, it was what Charlie would have wanted, and somehow JD would have to find the strength to provide it. As night fell across America, televisions in every time zone turned to Washington. People paused their evenings to watch. Men and women in airports gathered around terminal TVs, their flights temporarily forgotten. Students left study rooms and dorms, gathering in common areas where screens showed the same image. Diners fell quiet as servers turned up the volume on wall-mounted screens. Social feeds filled with pictures of Charlie and messages that read simply, "Please pray for Erica, pray for the children." JD felt the responsibility in every text, every shared image, every hashtag that spread across the digital landscape. His wife placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, whispering, "You can do this. Charlie would want you to do this. He believed in you, and so do I." He nodded slowly, murmuring a prayer for strength to fulfill the impossible task before him. The weight of expectation pressed against him from every direction, but so did the knowledge that millions needed someone to give voice to their grief. He stepped from his office, under the watchful eyes of the Secret Service agents who had become constant companions. The usually bustling corridors of the West Wing were subdued, staff lingering with red-rimmed eyes and bowed heads. Some reached out to touch his arm as he passed, small gestures of solidarity that said more than words could express. Reminders that he wasn't alone, even as he prepared to stand alone before the nation. He had no notes. He had chosen to speak from the heart, trusting that the words would come when they were needed, trusting that the bond he shared with Charlie would guide him through the moment. At the threshold to the briefing room, He steadied himself with a deep breath. Memories of Charlie flashed through his mind like a highlight reel of a life well lived. Charlie laughing backstage at an event, his joy infectious. Charlie addressing a crowd with that passionate intensity that could hold thousands in rapt attention. Charlie pulling his children close, his face softened with the love of a devoted father who never let professional success overshadow what mattered most. Then the doors opened, and JD stepped into the waiting silence that would define one of the most important moments of his life. The room went quiet the second he raised his head to address the assembled press and the millions watching through them. Every camera focused, every microphone poised, every heart waiting. Millions watched as he spoke plainly and painfully, calling the murder what it was and pledging relentless pursuit of justice for the perpetrator who remained at large. He reminded the nation of Charlie's faith and service, not as a political resume, but as a portrait of a soul, and he offered a prayer, short, earnest, heartfelt, entrusting Charlie's soul to God and asking for comfort for a grieving family who faced tomorrow without their husband and father. It wasn't a polished sermon, refined by multiple drafts and rehearsals. It was a man speaking in a moment of personal and national loss, finding words that somehow captured what millions were feeling. Those words landed on hearts across America with a force that transcended the political divisions of the moment. They didn't fix the hurt. Nothing could do that. They didn't answer the questions that kept people awake that night: who, why, what happens now. But for a time, they brought people together in shared sorrow. A nation paused to mourn a life that had inspired many, and in that pausing found something of the unity that Charlie had always championed. Across living rooms and parish halls, people found themselves wiping away tears they hadn't expected to shed. Small groups huddled in prayer, replaying JD's words on phones and church speakers. Families watching together fell silent, each person holding on to the same ache. What began as JD's private grief spread like a tide across the nation. It became something the whole country felt, owned, and carried together. He spoke not only with sorrow, but with a fierce pledge that gave the mourning purpose. Charlie Kirk's fight would not be forgotten. His vision would not die with him. His passion for young people, for truth, for the values he held dear, all of it would live on through those who loved him and through the institutions he built. As JD's first sentences moved through the airwaves, homes across America paused. People sat motionless, clinging to every phrase as if the words themselves could bring back what was lost. Some bowed their heads in prayer. Others reached instinctively for tissues. In tiny town sanctuaries, pastors queued up his remarks for their congregations. In dorm rooms, students who had once sparred with Charlie's ideas now whispered that they never imagined his voice could be cut so short, his life ended so abruptly. For one evening, political labels blurred into irrelevance. Americans from different walks of life shared the same wound. This was no longer simply about ideology or politics or the debates that usually divided them. It was the loss of a husband, a father, a man who had lived loudly by his convictions while loving quietly in his home. Social platforms saw hashtags surge to the top as strangers wrote as if they had lost kin. "I never met him," one post read that was shared thousands of times, "but tonight it feels like I lost a brother, someone who would have been my friend if we'd ever crossed paths." Inside the West Wing, aides gathered in hallways, some with tissues in hand, exchanging quiet, stunned looks that needed no translation. JD delivered his words not as a politician reading from a script designed to achieve some purpose, but as a friend whose world had been broken open. His voice trembled, but he pushed forward with determination born of love. "Charlie's children will grow up with stories instead of daily laughter," JD said, his voice catching on the terrible reality of those words. "Photographs instead of bedtime jokes, and a silence where their father's voice should have been." A collective intake of breath swept the room. Even seasoned reporters, veterans of countless tragedies and press conferences, lowered their cameras out of respect. The human weight of those words, the image of children who would never again hear their father's good night, cut through every professional barrier. "He poured himself into a cause he believed in," JD continued, steadying himself against the podium. "Faith, family, and freedom. He served others without counting the cost. He gave everything he had to that work." He paused, staring down at the podium, gathering himself before looking up with eyes that shone with tears he no longer tried to hide. "He was to many of us a hero. Tonight, he has gone home." Every word landed on televisions and phones across the nation. Families squeezed hands tighter, churches formed prayer circles, strangers in cars muted their radios and listened in silence that felt almost sacred. JD wasn't merely recalling a public figure, he was making sure the nation remembered the person behind the headlines, the friend, the father, the believer whose faith shaped every aspect of his life. He softened the memories, warming and sobering at once. He told a small, human story that illuminated who Charlie really was. Years ago, after an early television appearance when JD was still finding his footing in public life, a man he'd barely known took a moment to send a message of encouragement. That man was Charlie. That brief kindness, that small investment of time and attention, blossomed into a friendship that would shape both of their lives in ways neither could have predicted at the time. The room leaned in, every reporter sensing that this was something different from the usual political rhetoric, notebooks scratched quietly. "That unexpected outreach," JD said, his voice thickening with emotion, "opened doors neither of us could have predicted. It taught me that small kindnesses can change the trajectory of a life." JD recounted the ways Charlie had steadied him in hard seasons, late-night calls when doubt crept in and sleep wouldn't come, prayers offered when hope was thin and the criticism felt overwhelming, a shoulder to lean on when the strain of politics threatened to overwhelm home life and everything that mattered. He painted a portrait of a man who checked on families, sent encouraging texts at random moments just to let people know they were remembered, and never missed the little things that make life bearable when the spotlight burns hot. Outside the White House, vigils gathered in the growing darkness, candles flickered in plazas and college quads across America, their small flames pushing back against the night. People stood shoulder to shoulder, some singing hymns whose words took on new meaning, others simply holding signs and flags in quiet tribute. From coast to coast, the scenes repeated in their diversity and their unity. Parks, churches, and living rooms shared the same hushed reverence. For a rare moment, unity took the form of communal mourning that transcended every division that usually kept Americans apart. Think about this for a moment. Really, sit with it. A man who spent his life trying to unite young people around shared values, even when it made him unpopular, even when it drew mockery and criticism, even when it put him in physical danger. Charlie Kirk walked into hostile rooms because he believed conversation could change hearts, because he trusted that human connection was stronger than political division. And now, in death, he was doing what he had tried to do in life, bringing people together in a way that words alone had never quite managed. If that doesn't move you, I don't know what will. Let me know in the comments what you think about that legacy, that remarkable gift of unity that persisted even beyond his final breath. JD turned his attention to Charlie's wife and children, the family that had been the center of everything Charlie did. He used to say, "Politics can wait. My family can't," JD said softly, his voice catching on the simplicity of that profound truth. He loved being a husband. He loved being a dad. That was the center of his life, the foundation everything else was built upon. The imagined emptiness, the chair at the table that would remain empty, the quiet at bedtime where a father's voice should be, the celebrations that would be marked by who wasn't there, was an ache JD could not pretend to fix with words. But he urged the nation to step in, to fill the silence around that family with support, prayer, and grace, to surround them with the love that Charlie would have wanted them to receive. He remembered debates about faith, friendly sparring over theology that always ended with laughter because the thread that bound them was deeper than doctrine. Charlie wasn't merely a talker about faith. He lived it outwardly, in kindness that cost him nothing and meant everything, in courage that never wavered, and in a blunt honesty that drew followers, because it felt authentically different from the calculated performances that dominated public life. That authenticity, JD said, explained why so many, young and old, had been drawn to him. People can sense when someone truly believes what they say. Charlie believed. Every word, every day, in public and in private, he was the same person. One of the last things people would remember, JD reflected, was that Charlie died doing what he loved, speaking, engaging, inviting questions even from those who disagreed. Even when the room wasn't always kind, he showed up anyway. JD spoke of bravery and humility, of someone brave enough to stand in hostile territory and humble enough to listen to those who opposed everything he believed. His words were not just a eulogy. They were an invitation to live with the same conviction Charlie had modeled, to find that same courage in our own lives. He shared another memory, a small victory at a late, quiet rally where the crowd was thin, and the night felt heavy with discouragement. Even then, Charlie stayed late. He met every person who wanted to talk, gave each one his full attention. He offered encouragement that was specific and genuine. He reminded JD and everyone around him why they kept going, why the fight was worth fighting even when victory seemed distant. It was those tiny, steadfast moments, JD suggested, that defined a life more than any headline ever could. Not the big events that made the news, but the small kindnesses that never would. The cameras caught every tear that fell during those remarks. The nation watched a friend mourn, and many felt compelled to search within themselves for the same courage, the courage to stand for what they held dear, regardless of the cost. In his closing, JD asked for more than silence. He asked for living remembrance, acts of kindness in Charlie's name, faithfulness to family that honored his priorities, and a renewed commitment to the values Charlie had championed. We owe him that, JD finished, his voice steadier now but still charged with emotion. Not just our words tonight, but our lives tomorrow. Across the country, hands unclenched, candles continued to burn. And though the grief was sharp and immediate, JD's plea planted a seed. In honoring one life, a nation could be reminded of what it wants to protect in each other. I walked off that stage hollowed out. My chest felt raw, words gone, but in my memory, Charlie was there, an arm around my shoulder, that calm look in his eyes that always said things would be okay. "Brother," he had told me once after a difficult night when I'd questioned everything, "you don't need a stadium full of cheers to make a difference. One heart is enough. Tonight you reached more than one." Those words trembled on my lips as I spoke them to the nation. That was Charlie, the man who raised people up, who kept the big picture in view, even when the immediate moment seemed overwhelming. I left that memory with something I hadn't had in a long time. Hope. Not hope that came from applause or approval ratings, but from being held by someone who believed in me unconditionally. Across living rooms and kitchen tables that night, parents leaned close to their kids and whispered the same line. "One heart is enough." People wept as Charlie's words echoed louder after he was gone, carrying a truth that transcended the tragedy of his death. Charlie wasn't simply a leader who delivered speeches. He listened. In a world where experts excelled at shouting past each other, where cable news made noise that substituted for understanding, Charlie listened like it mattered, with his whole self. I looked down at the podium, then up again, feeling the memory of it all wash over me like a wave. I remember calling him on a night when I was spent. The attacks, the press, the endless grind had worn me thin. I expected a pep talk, the kind of motivational speech he was famous for delivering to crowds. Instead, he let me unload everything. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer quick fixes or empty platitudes. When I was done, he said simply, "I hear you, JD. I'm with you." Sometimes hearing someone say that is all the armor you need. My voice broke as I said that tonight. I wanted to call him one more time. I wanted one more "I'm with you." Instead, I have to believe he's listening from somewhere higher. And the nation felt that loss with me. Pastors, students, mums and dads, everyone watching felt like they had lost a friend who once sat with them through their hard nights. My hands tightened on the podium as grief turned into a promise. Charlie was my brother. Brothers don't leave each other to walk alone. Even in his absence, I felt him beside me. I spoke then with a steadier tone. "What happened to Charlie was an act of pure evil," I declared. "But evil won't have the final word. His life, faith, family, freedom lives on in each of us. Charlie's fight is our fight now," I said, tears cutting clean tracks down my face. "His mission is our mission. We will not rest until his vision burns brighter than ever." Outside the White House, people answered, not with cheers, but with resolve. A sea of candles bobbed under the night sky as strangers clasped hands with strangers, united by grief and a stubborn hope that refused to die. Millions watching from home cried openly. For them, that prayer was more than a speech. It was the nation's wound and its vow wrapped together. Earlier that day, I'd been in the Oval Office. The president didn't need to offer a speech. He just looked at me and said quietly, "I know he was a good friend. He loved his family." He was right. Charlie's heart was always at home with Erica and those children. That makes this loss unbearable in a different way. The world lost a leader, but that family lost their anchor, their center, their everything. I learned the news the way many of us did, from the people closest to him. My group chat started lighting up with desperate messages. "We're praying for Charlie." Not headlines, not briefings, just friends pleading for a miracle. I prayed too. I begged for healing. But tonight I can only trust that he's with the Lord now, talking to the big man straight. The phones that lit the night echoed that chat. 1,000 small lights holding a single terrible vacancy. What haunts me most is the empty chair. At dinners, at policy meetings, at late-night conversations, Charlie filled rooms with his presence. Now that place is silent. His kids will grow up with stories and photographs where his laughter should be. Erica will trace faces in pictures and wish for one more hug, one more conversation, one more ordinary day. We all feel that silence, the kind that no public statement can fill, no memorial can heal. For me, those hugs were everything. After every turning point event, after cameras dimmed and the last hand was shaken, Charlie pulled me in close. Not a quick, polite embrace, but a strong, brotherly hug that said things words couldn't express. He'd whisper, "I'm praying for you, JD. Keep fighting." That embrace carried me when I couldn't carry myself. In my darkest hours, I would remember it and stand up straight. For many watching, that memory became a symbol of loyalty and faith that no bullet could erase. Charlie had a rare gift. He could walk into a room full of tension and diffuse it with a word, with a smile, with genuine interest in the person across from him. I've seen protesters shout at him only to leave talking like neighbors. He didn't need to win an argument to change a heart. He listened. He built bridges when others wanted to burn them. That's what this nation lost. Not only a strategist or a public figure, but a person who believed conversations matter across campuses, in city squares, wherever people gathered to think and argue and grow. Candlelight vigils began across the nation, multiplying throughout the night. Students wrote signs from the heart that said what formal statements couldn't. People who never met him felt his presence through the work he left behind, a calm voice in a country full of noise. That voice is gone, and the silence is deafening. This morning the president told me something simple and true. Charlie helped us win hearts. Charlie wasn't chasing titles. He chased something harder, truth as he saw it, and in doing so, he changed the direction of countless young lives. Now the seat he filled in so many rooms will stay empty unless we decide otherwise. Will we leave it so? Or will we pick up his torch and carry it forward? For almost a full minute tonight, the whole country watched me bow my head. I prayed out loud. Father, receive your servant Charlie. Give Erica strength. Watch over those children. Help us honor him not with words alone, but by living what he believed. Across living rooms and city blocks, people whispered Amen as if we were in the same room together. In that hush, faith stirred for some who hadn't prayed in years. I straightened and gripped the podium. Charlie lit a torch, I said. They thought one bullet could extinguish it. They were wrong. Millions of us carry that flame now. The response wasn't a roar. It was a ripple of tears and nods. Online, people typed, "We'll carry it." Students who had felt aimless found new purpose. Families held hands tighter. Charlie didn't die silent. He speaks through every person who takes up his fight for truth, freedom, faith, and country. Vigils turned into promises, candles became small vows, strangers whispered, "I'll be a torchbearer." This wasn't only mourning anymore, it was a nation accepting responsibility to keep his work alive. I closed with the words that felt most true. Charlie, my brother, you ran the race well. You finished strong. Rest now. We've got it from here. I stepped back, palms damp, and the cameras caught a crowd that had watched the country weep and then resolve itself. Grief bent us low, but it also set our shoulders square. People vowed to love their families more fiercely, to speak truth where it mattered, and to live with the courage Charlie had shown. That night, candles flickered in every state, social feeds filled not with venom, but with prayer and unity. America mourned, and in that mourning, America lifted itself. Tonight's prayer will live on, one of the most raw, unifying moments this nation has seen in years. If Charlie's story touched you, let it move you to something real. Think about the people in your life who have been that steady voice for you, the ones who listened when you needed it most, who said, "I'm with you" when you felt alone, who believed in you before you believed in yourself. Reach out to them today. Don't wait. Tell them what they mean to you, because we never know how much time we have, how many conversations we have left, how many chances to say what matters. And now I want to thank you, every single one of you watching right now, for being part of this journey. This isn't just a story about one man. It's a story about what connects us all: faith, family, love, and the courage to stand for what we believe in, even when it costs us everything. If this video moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe to Celebrity Chronicles so you never miss another story that matters, another moment that deserves to be remembered. And please drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on JD Vance's prayer, on Charlie Kirk's legacy, or on how this story touched your heart. Because stories like these remind us who we really are. They remind us that in our darkest moments we have the choice to unite, to grieve together, to hope together, and to rise together. America wept and America rose. Thank you for watching. God bless you all, and God bless America.